I think it is best that I actually give some geographical and background information on the country for those viewing this video not familiar with the country, or those who are but only have a somewhat foggy idea about it. I should first mention something I failed to do in my last video, that I am from the island of St. Thomas in the U.S. Virgin Islands, with ties to the islands of St. Kitts and Nevis respectively, as my parents are from those two islands. As for St. Thomas, it sits about 918 miles to the northwest of Guyana in the Caribbean chain. Now, Guyana is a country on the northern coast of South America. It is the only English-speaking country on that continent. But don't let that fool you when it comes to its rich history. Now, while Guyana sits firmly on the South American mainland, it is often associated culturally, socially, politically, and historically with the English-speaking islands in the actual Caribbean chain of islands, notably those that were former British colonies. Guyana itself was once a British colony and part of the British West Indies up until 1966, when it gained its independence from England. Prior to that time, it was known as British Guyana from 1814, when the British took control of the land from the Dutch, who were the first to colonize the land area going back as far as 1616, when they set up a trading post to trade with the indigenous people 20 miles upstream from the mouth of the Essequibo River. While the land was actually a claim of Spain's, Spain paid little attention to it, allowing the Dutch to eventually entrench themselves and go on to found three colonies, Essequibo, Demerara, and Berbice, that today make up Guyana. Seeking to avoid confrontation and harassment from the Portuguese in Brazil to the south and southeast, the Spanish to the west and southwest, as well as the sometimes ANSI indigenous population to the south in the interior, the Dutch moved their operations of their new Essequibo colony further down the Essequibo to Fort Zeelandia, and eventually to the mangrove-filled coastline at the mouth of the Demerara River and eastward. The French took brief control of the colony in 1782 and named the new town on the Demerara River's mouth Longchamps, before the Dutch was able to regain control and call it Stabroek in 1784. When the area came under the control of the British in the early 1800s, it was renamed Georgetown, a name retained as the capital city of the country today. When the Dutch moved activity to the coastline, they were faced with an area exposed to the Atlantic Ocean, inundated with mangroves and frequent flooding from the interior rains. The area was actually below the sea level at high tide. Needing land to settle their growing population, the Dutch leaned on their expertise in dredging and dam building to make the area habitable. After all, the Dutch had mastered such things in their homeland in the Netherlands, where they were famously known for building dams and dikes to keep the ocean from overrunning their coastal regions. To undertake this, they used enslaved Africans to do the manual labor. You can still see the evidence in the Georgetown area of the many dams, back dams, and canals that kept floodwaters out or funneled water through and out of the city. By 1855, the British began construction on a seawall along the Atlantic coastline, starting at Georgetown, to keep the sometimes fierce Atlantic Ocean from overrunning the land. Today, the seawall runs 280 miles along the Atlantic coastline, protecting most of the country's population from storm surges. But there are times when the seawaters breach the wall and flood the immediate areas beyond the coastline. The country is almost twice the size of Cuba, 20 times larger than Jamaica, or about the size of the U.S. state of Idaho. Despite being relatively large and able to fit almost all of the Caribbean islands into it, the population is relatively small in relation to its size, with less than 800,000 people living there. Some 80% of the country's interior is carpeted in pristine forests, leaving much of the population relegated to the nearly 300 miles of Atlantic coastline on the country's north side. Much of Guyana, mostly to the south, sits on some of the oldest rock on the planet known as the Guyana Shield. From this highland area, the land slopes toward the Atlantic coastline, which falls below the sea level as mentioned earlier, hence the threat of flooding from the interior rains. The elevated area in the Guyana Shield provides some spectacular diversity in the landscape from otherworldly looking mountains such as the nearly 10,000-foot Mount Roraima Tepui, as well as others, the impressive Kaicher Falls, probably the world's highest single drop waterfall, to the vast savannas and plains. With the area being so old, parts of it produces some of the world's purest gold and diamonds, which can be found in or near the rivers. And speaking of rivers, Guyana, an Amerindian word meaning land of many waters, has no shortage of impressive ones. I've mentioned the Essequibo River earlier. It is the longest river in Guyana, running over 600 miles from the highland interior all the way to the Atlantic Ocean, where its estuary boasts a 20-mile wide expanse. Some 300 plus fluvian islands can be found within the river along its course, with the largest ones near the river's mouth, the largest being larger than St. John in the U.S. Virgin Islands. All the islands in the river, if combined, would be as large as the island of Barbados. The Essequibo is also the largest river in South America between the Amazon River and the Orinoco River in Venezuela. 20 miles back upstream, it converges with two other rivers, the Mazaruni and the Cuyuni, and at this convergence can be found the mining town of Bartica, the gateway to Guyana's interior. The Demerara River is further east, and in relation to the Essequibo, much smaller and 300 miles shorter, but still rather important, as at its mouth sits the capital city of Georgetown. It also passes through the town of Linden, Guyana's second largest city and birthplace of my wife, and starts out in the Macquarie Mountains, which I named my son after. The Demerara River runs along the more populated areas of Guyana. Further to the east is the next major river in Guyana, the Berbice River. The rivers start out in Guyana's bauxite-rich interior. Due to frequent rains in the interior, there is a lot of red dirt runoff into the rivers, turning and keeping the waters brown as they run into the Atlantic Ocean. This is what contributes to the brown water at the Guyana coastline, hence the lack of azure, blue, crystal clear waters seen further up in the Caribbean chain. Those waters are then caught up in the east to west flowing Guyana current just offshore, carrying other brown waters from river runoffs in nearby Suriname, French Guiana, and northeastern Brazil to feed the lower Caribbean Sea around the island of Trinidad, providing much needed nutrients to the marine life in the Caribbean Sea. The most interesting thing about Guyana by far is its people. The original peoples were the Amerindians, who occupied the area long before the time of Columbus, the Europeans, Africans, East Indians, and others. These people left mainland South America and populated the lower midsection of the Caribbean chain. The Europeans came and over time relegated the indigenous population to the interior sections where remnants of the original peoples still live in their various tribes. They are citizens of modern-day Guyana. As mentioned earlier, the Europeans brought in enslaved Africans to work in projects like dam building and eventually cane cutting, sugar processing, and rum manufacturing. The British, after taking over from the Dutch, continued the practice of using free African labor until they ended slavery all across their empire in 1834. This was not without consequence for both slave owners and formerly enslaved. You see, when slavery ended, the former enslaved individuals walked off the plantations and used their resistance to returning to these plantations as leverage at the bargaining table to receive reparations for the years of slavery. Former slave masters petitioned the government to compensate them for loss of labor and revenue due to the ending of slavery. The government capitulated to wealthy and influential planters like John Gladstone and paid handsome sums to them. Initially, the British government sought to fill the labor gap with workers from Africa, Portugal, and other parts of the Caribbean, but this recruitment eventually stopped. With England expending control into India, a new large labor force of poor Indians came into play. Gladstone, with the help of friends in the British Parliament, experimented with a new venture by implementing indentured servitude for Indian laborers on the island of Mauritius. When this proved successful, Indian laborers were sent to places like South Africa and as far as British Guyana, a place most of these laborers never heard of or knew where it was located. So on May 5th, 1838, the first Indian arrived in Guyana. This arrival was followed by a series of other ships to Guyana from India, bringing in hundreds of laborers to work on the various plantations in the three colonies, with the Berbice colony receiving the lion's share. With the arrival of the new workforce, the former enslaved Africans lost their leverage to push for compensation, setting a tone for future tension between the two groups that would become the dominant players in the population. The East Indians naturally kept to themselves and were allowed to keep their culture and faiths. Many came as families. This was in stark contrast to the former enslaved Africans who came in shackles, ripped from their families in Africa or upon arrival, and who were often not allowed to keep or practice their culture or faiths. In addition to East Indians coming to the British Guyana colonies, there were also the Portuguese, many of whom became store owners and merchants, along with the Chinese. The Portuguese, mostly from Madeira Island, were fleeing church tension, famine, and a decline in the popularity of the world-famous Madeiran wine due to the American Civil War, and took up the offer to migrate to the Caribbean in search of better fortunes. They first came to British Guyana, just like the East Indians. There were also a relatively large migration of people from the islands of Barbados and St. Lucia. British Guyana became an independent country in 1966. While a rather resource-rich country, American destabilization of the country, exploited tension between the two major groups along with government corruption has kept the country from realizing its full rich potential. There is hope that the recent discovery of oil offshore will change the fortunes of the country for the better. In some additional trivia tidbits, I should mention that atop the summit of Mount Roraima, which is Guyana's highest mountain, sits the borders of Guyana, Brazil, and Venezuela. Also, the most expensive stamp in the world came from British Guyana. The British Guyana 1-cent magneto sold for $9.5 million in 2014. Also, Guyana is one of the countries that made up a region in northern South America known as the Guyanas. There was Spanish Guyana, which is basically eastern Venezuela. There was Dutch Guyana, which we call Suriname today. There is French Guyana. And there was Portuguese Guyana, which is the northeastern Brazilian state of Amapa. And, of course, British Guyana, which is today's Guyana. So for those people who ask me questions about Guyana, especially those people who are from the Caribbean, you hear the word Caribbean and you may think that Guyana is a place with a bunch of beautiful blue beaches and strips of clubs and bars and so forth on the seashore. It is not like that. Guyana is a country that is rich in natural beauty, and it's very diverse in its landscape, just like its people. So it is a place that you can go to, and if you're into nature, you're into waterfalls, forests, diversity of animals, looking over vast expanses of land, and just looking at the natural beauty of nature, Guyana is indeed a place I would recommend that you visit. So, I'll be moving on to the next video, but hopefully this video sheds some light on what Guyana is, what it's really all about, and give you some history and some background to this beautiful country. So until the next time, this is your Serial Cynic.